Welcome to episode 112 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 20 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag. Let's get started with my first topic. And news broke last week about Amazon's intent to acquire iRobot for almost $2 billion. And the question that's on many people's minds, are there any sort of plans to get into enabling a 5G robot? And I know that Amazon has they have a robot that they've launched that's like for home use and that sort of thing. They've acquired other robotic companies in the past to manage, their warehousing operations and that sort of thing. But what's interesting, a lot of people may not know this, and actually our friend Mike Dano at Light Reading wrote an article at about the same time they made that announcement. Amazon also entered into a licensing agreement with a company called InterDigital, and they're an R&D company that's focused on wireless technology. And in fact, companies like Asus and Xiaomi have license agreements with InterDigital. So it may not be too far of a stretch, to determine that Amazon may have designs to do something from a 5G enablement perspective with a robot in the home. But what are your thoughts?
I think Amazon is one of those companies that has, many different pots boiling at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And, they've got stuff going on in 5G. They've got stuff going on in robotics. They have that home robot that they announced. I forgot what it was called.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
thinking the name.
so like there's tons of different things that they're actively working on individually. And I have a feeling that slowly those are all going to come together. So I don't think it's crazy to think that there's a potential for a 5G robot down the road from Amazon. But I think that there's still other things that they're working on that very likely um, still need to mature before I think they will be ready to come to market with something like that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one of the big poster child use cases, other than autonomous driving, for 5G, based on its low latency and the high throughput, is drone delivery, right? And so that's something that's probably one of the other pots that's boiling on the Amazon stovetop there. But it's interesting, I've read some other analysis on the iRobot thing, and some analysts believe that gives Amazon the opportunity to understand kind of the interior digital mapping opportunity within homes for like smart homes and their ecosystem of Alexa devices. But it's interesting that both sort of occurred about the same time. But we'll see what's in store. But let's move to your first topic this week. And there was a really big agreement that the president signed this week. It's the Chips and Science Act. And you want to talk about what that potentially means for both 5G and 6G.
Yeah, so the Chips and Science Act is a $280 billion funding bill. So the CHIPS Act has actually been like kind of agreed to in multiple ways through different parts of the legislative branch,
Mm-hmm.
but it never got funded. And the way the U.S. government works, unless you have funding, it means nothing. So they managed to get $280 billion of this package passed. He signed it on Tuesday, but out of that 280 billion, 52 is specifically dedicated towards chips. And it's not just fabs, but it's
Yeah.
also R&D and education and basically a way to create and deepen the industry within the United States that would facilitate our own homegrown ability to create chips. We already do have some of that, but
Yeah.
it's fairly isolated within, let's say a couple companies. And then there's a lot of companies abroad that have these capabilities that are bringing them to the US, but they are not homegrown.
Yeah.
And some of those are, a 25% tax credit. One of those is $1.5 billion for open architecture software-based wireless technologies, also known as ORAN.
Right.
So there's definitely some very specific 5G applications in this. And that 52 billion is, focused specifically towards chip production, but there's that 1.5 for ORAN, and there's
Yeah.
a tax credits, which is worth 24 billion for semiconductor manufacturing. So there's little pieces here and there that are, I think, really compelling, and I think will enable some really positive advances for chip making in the US.
I would agree. You mentioned we do have fabrication here. It's kind of concentrated with a few companies, and we've also talked on prior podcasts about companies like Qualcomm and Marvell that are leading the charge with respect to enabling the 5G ecosystem. Both of those companies have done Open RAN accelerator cards. And so my assumption is this funding would help, accelerate, proliferate, that activity beyond just a very small, number of companies. So I think it's a positive thing. A lot of times these bills are kind of, rhetoric and that sort of thing, but there's some significant budget behind this. I mean, billions of dollars. I mean, that's a lot of money. But as you and I know in the semiconductor industry, just to bring up a new fab, what is the average these days? 20, 30
And
billion to do that?
it's in the 10 to 20 billion per
Yeah,
fab.
it's huge. And I know this because I live in Austin, Texas, and in Taylor, right outside of town. In fact, I was driving to visit my daughter one weekend, and I drove by the area where Samsung is building this new fab, and just the scale is it's unbelievable.
Yeah,
It's
I think that one's 17 billion.
yeah. So it's massive, and so it's going to require not only budget, but a discrete focus. So I think it's all a good thing. So, but let's move to my second topic this week. And on the heels of the 5G spectrum auctions in India, news was breaking this week from Airtel, and they're stating that they have big designs on standalone private 5G networking services. And I found it interesting that they believe that by 2024, over 40% of their overall revenue that they drive off of their 5G deployment and investment could be in private. And that's not a surprise to me. There is a lot of manufacturing, which I think would benefit in India. But at the same time, I found it interesting as well because we've also talked about another topic, and it's the reluctance. It seems like the reluctance of the Indian government to do something that's very similar to OnGo CBRS in the US, where they democratize, the availability of spectrum and allow individual enterprises, municipalities, schools, whatnot, um, the ability to be able to purchase or lease and then deploy their own networks. In the US, there are multiple routes to private 5G. And it seems in India, it's going to be through the mobile network operator because in this press release that I read, the Minister for Electronics, IT, and Communications stated that allocating 5G spectrum to private companies would be a very complex issue. But I think they could learn from what the U.S. has done. There are some other examples of this sort of spectrum democratization in parts of Europe and that sort of thing. And so I think it'll be really limiting because from my perspective, if you limit the number of paths to deploy private 5G networking, you're going to limit innovation. And I think also you're going to set a price at a certain level. And typically when you have more routes to a certain solution, that drives affordability as well. But what do you think about all this?
I think it's kind of a given that they would do something like this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I do think that there are going to be a lot of enterprise applications, especially if they go SA early and
Yeah.
fast. Devices are there. I think they could go straight SA right away. It would allow them to actually split out their network in a way where I don't really think they need to actually have, um, OnGo or some kind of dedicated spectrum sharing. Because
Yeah.
if they're able to splice out their network correctly and use network slicing, they could actually just slice out parts of their network as
Yeah.
needed.
Yeah, my only point in mentioning, like an on-go model is just, allowing non-mobile network operators to, provide solutions, like we have in the US today. So, but it'll be interesting, obviously India is a market that's well behind most of the other markets with respect to cellular and its 5G deployment. I mean, they just, finished up these auctions just recently. We've been at it in the US, and, China's been at it, and, Europe's been at it for quite a bit longer there, but it'll be interesting to see how it goes. But let's move to your second topic this week. And I caught this news as well. There was an FCC pullback on funding tied to Starlink and a company called LTD Broadband. And you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so there's funding that's been allocated basically by the FCC to give broadband access, around the world, and specifically within North America, but the idea is that it could be used elsewhere. And the RDOF funding, which it stands for Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. There's $9.2 billion in this fund, and two organizations, LTD Broadband and Starlink, got 1.3 billion and then $885 million respectively, to provide 100 megabit down, 20 megabit up service to 642,925 locations across 35 states, which is very specific. And it's as a result of an auction, but basically the FCC declined their application to get this funding. And they say that, in Starlink's case, the decision was based on factors indicating the technology is not yet ready for prime time. And then in a public notice, FCC cited recent Ookla data, which showed Starlink speeds declined from Q4 21 and Q2 22, and it pointed that Starlink's uplink speeds came in well below the promised 20 megabits. So this isn't really a shocker if you look at like some of the notices and things that were posted, and why they would make this move. But I think it was a bit of a shock to a lot of people because they thought this was kind of a done deal.
Right.
And I have to be honest with you, it's almost a little refreshing to see the FCC calling out ISPs when they don't actually deliver. However, this does feel like a little bit of a rug pull at the same time, because this is a lot of money. And this is a lot of money that I think both these companies were expecting to facilitate their operations and their profitability. And yeah, the statement that Jessica Rosenworcel gave was that Starlink's technology has a real promise, but the question before us was whether to publicly subsidize its still developing technology for consumer broadband. So it remains to be seen what the what the outcome will be as a result of this. But they will forfeit the funds, and they will go back into the Universal Service Fund, which will be available for other state and federal funding. And yeah, it's pretty shocking. It's a lot of money, and I have a feeling that there will be lawsuits thrown left and right as a result of this. But they did technically not deliver on their bid.
Right. And I wasn't aware that there was actually a performance degradation over subsequent quarters with Starlink. And so I understand that. It's interesting. So I participated in a digital divide forum this week, and actually I did a fireside chat with Jeff Long, who is with AT&T as a senior executive, and he heads up their broadband initiatives. And we talked about this subject. And one of the points that I made was, on the FCC setting this minimum performance requirement, that's great. But when you're too prescriptive, then it prevents the ability to even get started, in bridging, the unconnected. And, certainly if Starlink has demonstrated, performance hits, then that calls things into question. And if there was concern around, the platform, the technology not being ready for prime time yet, I get it. But I think to your point, that those were dollars that Starlink was banking on. Did they, based on that, did they engage in certain, engineering sort of NRE activities that have real costs associated with them? And is there going to be a financial impact for that, for that?
I also wanted to add that there were the RDOF rules actually set speeds at 25 down to 3 up as a minimum, and
Okay.
that there were different tiers of 25, 50, 100, and 1 gigabit, and that they were most of 99% of the locations were bid at 100 megabits and down and 20 up. So they did have a choice to actually bid at lower speeds, but it probably also might have translated to less funding.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I'm actually reading an article from Diana over at Fierce Wireless or for Fierce Telecom back from June,
Yeah.
where she kind of details how Starlink's latest Ookla results what they might mean for their RDOF funding, and it looks like that was a bad omen.
Oh,
Because,
Diana.
yeah, they missed their target, and it sounds like they may have known this was coming.
Yeah, so Diana can take her victory lap on that. So we'll have to have her on a future podcast as well. It's been a while since we've had her on. Well, let's move to my third and final topic this week. And I want to talk about a 5G neutral host, a millimeter wave trial that's occurring in Paris. And I was just there. We've talked about that on prior podcasts. But this is in an area called La Défense. And La Défense is a suburb just right outside of Paris proper. I know it well because when I worked in corporate America, I worked for Dassault Systems. That is the software division of Dassault Aviation. And they deliver a product called CATIA, as well as a number of other different solutions. But CATIA is a CAD/CAM solution. And La Défense is known as sort of a technical hub. And so this, from my perspective, is a great place to deploy these particular trials. And some of the use cases that they're looking at are autonomous mobility services, smart energy grid systems, various telehealth solutions and e-health solutions, IoT monitoring and tracking, and then near and dear to your heart, some AR, VR cases as well. And, and certainly, with millimeter wave, that's going to support, those mixed reality use cases. And, we've talked about that on prior podcasts as well, the use of mixed reality in like sporting venues where you do have, millimeter wave deployed. But I think, this is another great example of, both, government and industry coming together to basically, deploy test beds to test, the veracity of, of 5G and its impact on, particular use cases. So I think it's pretty exciting. I don't know if you caught the article, if you had anything further to add, but I thought it was an interesting topic to bring up on the podcast this week.
I did not, but I do know that one of the upstart AR VR companies is actually based out of France. They're called Lynx. So I have a feeling that they'll probably be involved in some of this, because they have a mixed reality headset that they're launching very soon, and I actually kickstarted back in the day last year when they launched their Kickstarter, and they should be launching anytime now. But yeah, I think there's a lot of really innovative work going on in France, as trying to keep pace with the rest of the industry, whether it be whether it be Spain or Germany or the US or Korea. So I think it's really important for every country to be seriously investing in 5G.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'll just kind of end with the point that Nokia is a big partner. There are a couple of UK firms that are sort of focused on fiber backhaul that are involved. So this isn't just purely an effort by the country of France. I mean, it's a multi-country effort. So good stuff. But let's move to your third and final topic, and you want to talk about earnings with Softbank and ARM, and it's sort of a tale of two cities if we want to keep that French theme going.
So what happened was SoftBank reported their second quarter earnings, which they call Q1, which can be confusing.
Yeah.
But they reported $23 billion in losses,
Whoa.
with 21 billion of that being attributed directly to their vision fund, which are a lot of their high tech investments.
Yeah.
And then they also attributed a couple billion to losses in like the yen to the dollar weakening, which when you're dealing with tens of billions of dollars, that can a 10% difference can make that
Huge.
difference,
Yeah.
especially when all their debt is in the yen. And then on top of that, ARM, which is still part of SoftBank, because SoftBank did buy them and tried to sell them to NVIDIA and failed. They are now planning an IPO, and ARM was able to report its own segment revenues, and sales went up 25%, and their EBITDA was up 240%, which was a combination of increased revenue, but also cost cuts. They did lay off a lot of people in the last quarter. So there are some, staff trimming that was a result of this increased profitability. And as you can imagine, this profitability is something you want to show prior to doing an IPO. IPOing at this time is probably not the greatest considering the current market conditions.
Right.
So it's a question of when they'll decide to IPO and if they really will do it. But their CEO, Renee Haas, did say that they are still on track to do an IPO. So it remains to be seen when that will happen. But it will be interesting to see, what that ends up looking like when they come to market. Other than that, SoftBank is still very much, they're a mobile operator as well, but all these things that are going on around SoftBank have kind of dwarfed that business.
Yeah.
And at this point, SoftBank is more known for their investments than they are their actual ISP business.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that they also, I think yesterday, announced that they're going to be offloading some of their Alibaba shares to offset some of the losses that they've had, because Alibaba is one of their best investments that they ever made. And
Right.
I think it's kind of the reason why nobody is necessarily screaming doom and gloom on SoftBank, because they still have, that Alibaba investment as a backstop.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised to see SoftBank's performance because unfortunately, over the last several quarters, they've been on that downward spiral. I was surprised to see ARM posting record revenue. Because this has been a pretty awkward transition for them as they shift gears from being an acquisition target to launching an IPO, which to your point, not the best time economically to do something like that. It's probably going to be another year out, but who knows? But I'm curious. So I didn't dig into the record revenue. What was responsible for the record revenue?
Licensing, lots
Well,
of licensing.
but specifically in sort of what kind of use case areas?
So they're not breaking that out.
They're
And part
not.
of that is because, they're a division within a division, right? So, but
Okay.
I believe that a big portion of that is one, that they have, the mobile market is still large for them, and their
Right.
customers are still shipping a considerable amount of smartphones. But also, there's a lot more ARM cores in infrastructure. There's a lot more ARM cores in data center, and
Yeah.
all of those cores are licenses as well. So
Yeah.
I think it's the expansion of server. I think it's expansion of IoT.
Yeah.
And those are kind of bets that they put down years ago
Hmm.
that weren't necessarily paying dividends in terms of volume, but I have a feeling that they are today.
Cool. Well, yeah, I'm glad you could share some insights on that because that's a very good point. They don't publish that information
And
typically.
I also think that auto will be a factor as well. I think
Yeah.
when ARM becomes an independent company again, we'll get much better vision into different parts of
Yeah.
their licensing business.
Yeah. Certainly when they're on their own, there'll be better granularity into specifically their business unit. So, well, great, my friend. It was another awesome podcast this week. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide insights for a specific top 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Willtown Tech, and I'm at Anshel Sog. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune again next week.